What I want to do is set this in a bigger context, because one of the things we're thinking about here is how we make sense of our world, how we kind of way live and work meaningfully within it. And so you might ask, well, what are the things we're going to try and bring together in doing this? And obviously you might think, well, the science has quite a lot to say about this. You might also say there's ethics, which is really about how we try and behave or live in this world. There might be religion as well. And of course, you might say, well, there's literature, there's philosophy, there's poetry as well. So in many ways, I'm asking, is there some way in which we can say these are all important, we bring them together? Or do we find that we get friction when we do this? Do we have to make decisions about, for example, well, whether we trust this or that or the other? And even if we decide to try and bring some things together, how are we able to do this without kind of way ending up with some kind of mental compartmentalization? Is this a real integration, or is it just different bits of our lives where we function in different ways? Now, my own background is I'm a scientist who kind of got interested in theology. But when I was studying science, I think I began to realize that science was more complicated than I had thought. I think I began by thinking that science kind of way gave us the most reliable information about our world we could, and that basically the way science worked was the way everything ought to work. In other words, a scientist in trying to answer some sort of question would think of doing an experiment. But I began to realize that there are some areas where you just really can't do this. For example, questions of right and wrong, or these deeper questions of meaning. And so one of the questions I want to lay out before you for discussion is this. One of the things I think science is really good at is helping us to understand how our world works. But I think we need more than that. We need to try and understand what things mean. It's not enough to understand how we work, so to speak. How do we actually live in this world? What do we mean? And I don't think Jeanette Winterson is here at this festival, but she wrote a rather splendid book, which has a title I'm really jealous of. Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal? I mean, I wish I'd written a book of that title. It's just great. But she makes this point in the book. She says, look, we are meaning-seeking animals. We just can't be content with living and hunting and recreating, that we're looking for something deeper. And in many ways, that's the kind of agenda I'm beginning to think about this morning. What I'm going to suggest to you is that here is a way of thinking that I found helpful, and I'm kind of way throwing this at you in case you find this helpful as well. When I was a scientist, one of the things I discovered is that science develops different research methods, different ways of investigating our world, depending on the kind of topic that you want to look at. So a physicist might do it this way, a biologist might do it that way, but they're all doing science. It's just that the area of science means that we use slightly different ways. Now, some of you will have read a biologist called Stephen Rose. Stephen Rose written quite a lot of very interesting books. I'm sure he's spoken at this festival in the past. But here's something he said, and I want you to think about this and see if you think he's right. He says, I am convinced of the ontological unity of our world, but we have to use a methodological pluralism. I'll say it again. Ontological unity of our world, of reality, but methodological pluralism. What did he mean? He says, look, there's just one reality, okay? But nevertheless, we have to use different ways, different methods to try and make sense of it. And the question then is, how we bring the outcomes of these together to get a bigger picture? And I think he's right. Werner Heisenberg, who I studied when I was doing quantum theory at Oxford many years ago, said something very, very similar. He says, we always got to remember that it's not reality we're looking at. It's reality as it is disclosed by our research methods. So each research method gives you an angle, a kind of a way of approaching something, but it doesn't give you the full picture. So for me, that kind of way is the issue I'm going to explore with you this morning. What I'm going to suggest is that in general, maybe there are different ways of engaging our world at different levels. And a research method that works very well in one area doesn't work so well in another. A good example, science and ethics. Now, science is very, very good at telling us how things work, but David Hume famously said, and I've yet to see a rebuttal of this, that basically science cannot make the transition from this is the way things are to this is the way things ought to be. In other words, science really can help us think about ethics. It can inform our thinking, but nevertheless, it's not going to give us answers to questions like what is right and what is wrong. Now that's really interesting as far as I'm concerned, because it raises this question. Science isn't able to really deal with ethical questions. So what happens if you are a scientist, and I'm sure there are many here this morning, and you want to think about ethical questions? Does the fact that ethics works in one way and science in another way mean that science is incompatible with ethics? Well, no. It just means that you use this method in science, use different methods in ethics, but there are scientists, as we all know, who are passionately committed to ethical questions. Global warming being a very good example of that, but there are many others as well. So let me try and make this more interesting by looking at a writer who I think you'll all have heard of, who I think writes well on these themes. This is Albert Einstein. And I first began to look at Einstein when I began to study chemistry back in Oxford in 1971, and I kind of stayed with him ever since because he's a very interesting writer. And Einstein was convinced that there is one big picture, one way of looking at things which actually makes sense of our world, but it has different elements, okay? So he is, as you will all know, a wonderful scientist, probably the best known scientist of the 20th century, and he deserves an accolade. And in many ways, he's someone who has worked hard to help us understand how science functions. But as many of you will know, Einstein was also very interested in ethics and very interested in religion. So let me give you a quote, if I may, from a lecture he gave talking about the relationship of science, religion, and ethics. Here we go. This is Einstein from a lecture of 1939. Science, he writes, cannot create ends, and even less instill them in human beings. At most, it can supply the means by which to attain certain ends. And the point he's trying to make here is that science is great, and it may help us inform our ethical thinking, but it doesn't give us the answers. Again, here's another quote from that same lecture. The scientific method can teach us nothing beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other. The knowledge of what is does not open the door directly to the knowledge of what should be. One may have the clearest and most complete knowledge of what is, and yet not be able to deduce from that what should be the goal of our human aspirations. So what Einstein is saying is that basically when it comes to his politics and his ethics, science might help a little bit, but really he's using a different method. Now, many of you will know that Einstein was a very committed socialist and in effect got his socialist values, not from science, but in effect from reflecting on what it meant to be a human being, especially with the situation of the 1930s in Nazi Germany. As many of you will know, Einstein was German and in effect had to leave Germany because he was Jewish in 1933 and settled in the United States. So here's my point. Einstein was absolutely convinced you can be a scientist, he was, and you can be a socialist, he was, and saw these in effect as being two aspects of his life, two bits of this bigger picture, if you like. So think about this. Is a scientist allowed to be a socialist? Or we don't like socialism. Is a scientist allowed to be a political liberal or a political conservative? I think the answer has to be yes, because science doesn't lay down this is the way you've got to be politically or ethically. And then we move on to the whole area of religion. This to me is really interesting. Einstein took the view that religion really is important. He had his own view of what religion was. He did not believe in a personal God. He believed in a God who was the mind behind this universe. And science could help you kind of way know something about this God. And it was really a fundamental motivation for doing science. But he didn't really like his own Jewish religion very much, or Christianity, or anything actually. But he liked this idea of there being something deeply religious about the way the world was. And again, that was part of the way he was. And Einstein, for example, talks about his idea of what God is like. Listen to this. I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the orderly of harmony of what exists. Or again, I have a firm belief in a superior mind that reveals itself in the world of experience.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.